Good afternoon, everyone. So my name's John Palmer. I'm director and owner of Our Building Control Solutions. We're a medium-sized private building control body, a registered building control approver based in Newbury. We cover areas Cambridge, down to Oxford, down towards Southampton, Bristol, Reading, the Cotswolds, all in a big arc and around London itself. So the plan for today is to provide an overview of the building regulations, start looking at the duty holder regime that was brought in from the 1st of October 2023. And that was a direct result of the Grenfell Tower disaster in 2017, which was the genesis for the Building Safety Act 2022. We'll talk a little bit about building control and how that's changed and how professionals within the built environment may well find a different approach in terms of building control bodies, and explore why that is. And finish off the main focus of the presentation relating to recent and upcoming guidance relating to fire safety. But just ask you to ponder whether a building control final certificate proves compliance with the building regulations themselves, a final certificate or a completion certificate in the case of a local authority. And I would ask you to bear that question, that phraseology in your mind as we run through the slides today. So to go back to basics, really, the Building Act 1984 is the primary piece of statute that governs the building regulations and all work within England and Wales in the built environment. Section 1 of the Building Act itself enables the Secretary of State of the day to make provisions under the form of building regulations. And the provisions that they are able to make building regulations is relating to the health, safety, and welfare of persons in and around buildings. Now, often some of the confusion that happens with those in the built environment is relating to approved documents and the status of an approved document. So Section 6 of the Building Act enables the Secretary of State to approve documents for the purposes of providing statutory guidance relating to meeting the provisions of the building regulations themselves. And that's, in essence, what an approved document is. It's a document that's been approved by the Secretary of State as a methodology, a practical methodology in some building cases of providing guidance on how to meet the requirements of the building regulations themselves. Now, that shouldn't be confused that the approved documents are law, because they are not. They remain guidance. And the legal basis that an approved document has is detailed within Section 7 of the Building Act itself. So if you look at that slide there, Section 7(1)(b), proof of compliance with such a document may be relied on as tending to negative liability. So if you follow the guidance within the approved documents, then you are tending to negative liability. That doesn't mean that if you follow the approved documents, you have automatically met the requirements of the building regulations. It doesn't mean if you divert from the guidance within the approved documents that you have automatically breached the building regulations. The legal status of an approved document is that it may be relied upon as tending to negative liability, which means that variation from the approved document can be relied upon as tending to positive liability. That is the legal status that an approved document has. To try and understand the hierarchy of guidance within the built environment, I've produced this slide here. So you can see there at the top is law. So we have the primary legislation, the Building Act. We'll come to the Building Safety Act shortly. Underneath that is secondary legislation, building regulations, also known as statutory instruments. So they enable the regulations to be enforced as an instrument of statute. Now, underneath that is the guidance, which we've talked about, approved documents, approved, sanctioned by the government, methodologies, practical guidance on how to meet the requirements of the building regulations. But, as I've said, the approved documents are not law. You can vary from them. And therefore, there are various other methods, most commonly British standards, which is other recognized guidance on how you can achieve compliance to the building regulations. Sitting underneath that is trade body standards and similar, most famously, the NHBC standards. Now, that framework has been in place since 1984 with the Building Act, building regulations, other secondary legislation contributing with statutory guidance and British standards underneath. In June 2017, tragically, 72 people lost their lives, and the subsequent phase 2 inquiry concluded that all of the lives lost were avoidable. And it was a systematic failure of all elements of the built environment, from central government to local government to contractors, architects, installers, material providers. All elements of the built environment failed, which led tragically to the death of those 72 people. And that led to the Building Safety Act. So Grenfell happened in June 2017. 2018, Dame Judith Hackett produced a report of an independent review of building regulations and fire safety, Building the Safety Future in 2018, and that led to the Building Safety Act in 2022. And that enabled changes to the building regulations that have come in over various periods of time, but most notably from the 1st of October 2023, which created the so-called duty holder regime that many of you will have heard about. The amendments to the building regulations that came in from the 1st of October 2023 that created this so-called duty holder regime. If you take anything away from today, is although the terminology is utilized is the same as that of the CDM Regs 2015, there is no interaction between the two in only a couple of instances. So the terminology of principal designer and principal contractor, client and domestic client, those are terminologies that were in the CDM Regs 2015, but they were transposed and created to have new legal definitions within the building regulations 2010 due to the amendments that came in from the 1st of October 2023. The similarities to the CDM regs, and there are many, relating to the terminology and similar, but the roles are completely different. CDM regs relating to construction design management and the health and safety of people in and around that construction site as ongoing, whereas the building regulations requirements for building work as defined under Regulation 3 of the building regulations. The building regulations amendments that came in from the 1st of October 2023 split the duties to that of a client and a domestic client, because the understanding, rightly or wrongly, is that a domestic client does not have the necessary competence to be able to undertake the role that a client does. And so therefore, some of those duties that a client would undertake are defaulted to other persons in the case of a domestic client. It's really important. The first thing that anyone within the built environment that's engaging with building work should determine first is whether they are working on behalf of a client or a domestic client. It's really, really important. And those definitions defined within Regulation 2 of the building regulations, interpretations, basically definitions. So as I mentioned, the terminology is similar to that of the CDM regs, but have completely different responsibilities under the building regulations. So a principal designer is defined within the building regulations and is required on all building work that is taking place in England and Wales, irrespective of the scale. So a lot of miscommunication or misunderstanding regarding the Building Safety Act is that it's just relating to HRBs, so buildings above 18 meters in height or 7 stories, and that's just definitively not the case. All building work from the lowest garage conversion and loft conversion for a single domestic or single client still requires a principal designer and principal contractor. Now, the roles of that principal designer, I've just extracted some. I would highly recommend that you go away and read, if you're involved in the built environment, read that section of the building regulations under Part 2A of the building regulations now. It's not particularly long, but really, really important. I've extracted some of it just to get a flavor of what it says. So the responsibility is under the principal designer is to take all reasonable steps to ensure the building work as designed would meet the requirements of the building regulations. You must be competent to do the task that you're being asked to undertake. And if you are not competent to do it, then you should cease doing it and refuse to act. Any person carrying out design work must cooperate with all those other duty holders associated with the project, principal contractor or principal designer or the client. And really importantly, which I think is often missed at the moment, that under 11K1 of the building regulations themselves, designer must not start the design work unless satisfied that the client is aware of their duties owed by the client for the building work to which the design relates under all relevant requirements. In essence, you should not start any design work for the purposes of building regulations unless you have communicated the client's obligations to them and made it clear. Another thing that I think is often missed is that when a principal designer appointment ends, no later than 28 days after that end, must give a document to the client explaining arrangements under duties 11M1-3 and 11M5, duties of taking all reasonable steps, planning, managing, monitoring, communicating with all relevant duty holders. Those obligations, what would you have done if you'd been retained as principal designer throughout the entirety of the project itself? Now, the principal designer and principal contractor roles are exactly the same in terms of their totality, in terms of legal obligations. The similarities between the two terminologies exactly the same. You have the responsibilities to plan, manage, monitor, communicate to all relevant duty holders. Another thing, the variation from the principal contractor obligations is that the principal designer has an obligation to design something that, if it were built, would be in accordance with the building regulations. Whereas the principal contractor's obligation are to build so that the building will be in accordance with the building regulations, which is really critical, important difference, because a defense from a principal contractor for a non-compliant building cannot be that they have built it in accordance with the design. They should have been competent, if that design was wrong, to identify the non-compliance within the design and identify it and communicate it to all other duty holders to ensure that the building itself would comply to the building regulations. A real life example, which springs to my mind, is I recently visited a site where the structural engineer had stipulated or assumed, that it was masonry construction. And when visiting the site, it turned out it was timber frame construction. And the contractor had installed pound stones on top of cripple studs. Clearly, it wouldn't meet the requirements of Part A, Schedule 1 of the building regulations. And him just saying it's in accordance with the design is not a defense. He should have been competent to identify that the design was based on false assumptions, communicated that to all relevant duty holders, and engaged with those competent people to amend a design to make sure that it was built and designed in accordance with building regulations themselves. So I've talked a lot about competence in terms of you must be competent to do the task you're being asked to undertake. And if you cease being competent, or you're asked to do something you're not competent in doing so, then you should not act. And that's set out within law itself, at that Part 2A that I've mentioned, to the building regulations themselves. And that's enabled via Section 35 of the Building Safety Act. It brings in this element. It enables the building regulations to create statute relating to competence. Competence is a difficult thing to define. Under the building regulations, it's defined as skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviors. So not necessarily formal qualifications, but that would obviously form part of it in certain roles. There's a couple of PAS documents which I've highlighted there, and a number of bodies have produced their own guidance regarding what the principal designer should undertake. And I think actually, my concern is that principal contractors are not fully aware of their obligations, and that all of those elements I've talked about in terms of principal contractors, principal designers, clients, and domestic clients, all of that comes to a head in a building project due to the need to provide compliance declarations at the end of the project. And what a compliance declaration is the duty holder, PD, PC, or client, and domestic client included, confirming that they have acted in accordance with their legal obligations under Part 2A of the building regulations themselves. You have planned, managed, and monitored. You communicated with all relevant duty holders. You have built in accordance with the building regulations. You have designed in accordance with the building regulations. Now, as a building control body, as a private building control body, as a registered building control approver, we have to have these statements from the duty holders at the end of the project. And it's included within our final certificate to stipulate that OWL, in our example, have received these statements from the duty holders relating to their obligations under Part 2A. So we need those obligations, otherwise we're issuing a legal document that we know to be incorrect. Carry some pretty serious implications if we were to do so. One amendment to that is a recent amendment that came into force in 7th October 2025, so a couple of months ago or so. And what that is so from the 1st of October 2023 up until the 7th of October 2025, all duty holders were obligated to provide a compliance declaration. Now, due to amendments to the building regulations after 7th of October 2025, for any reason, a client can stipulate that they have been unable to provide the compliance declarations from principal contractor, principal designer. Not many, I think, have clocked onto this, and they're still providing them, which I think I would highly recommend that they do. I think that the absence of the need to provide those compliance declarations is seen as a solution within government for real-life instances, such as a principal designer, a principal contractor dying ill, etc., moving, going out of business. But I do think it has the potential to cause a huge amount of confusion about who actually was undertaking that role during the construction design phase of the project. I've extracted a box down on the bottom left-hand side there, and I think it's something that we'll come to in terms of the guidance, talking about in terms of ADB and Treble 91 and similar. And this is an extraction from the building safety regulators guidance document called Strategic Context, and I would just highlight section 3.7. So what it says is that building control should expect duty holders to practically demonstrate how their project will comply with the building regulations, which should include how the project meets the functional requirements of the building regulations, and it should include evidence on how duty holders have assessed the appropriateness of the guidance used to demonstrate specific elements of compliance. So as duty holders within the built environment, as PDs and PCs, as clients, you are expected to be competent, and you have that legal obligation of competence to identify the correct guidance that you will use to design and build the building work, and justify to the building control body why that guidance is suitable. And I will just touch on, in terms of registered building inspectors, we now are a registered profession on the same level as lawyers and solicitors and surgeons and doctors and similar. So we have restricted activities which you have to be registered with the government to be able to do. So plan checking and site inspections, for the purposes of building control, is a restricted activity, one step further than architects perhaps that have a restricted title. And as I mentioned, this was all due to, and the changing nature of building control itself, it's due to the criticisms from the Grenfell Phase 2 inquiry, which that section 113.35 is one that's really worth reading from a building control perspective. And I'll just read it by rote because it's worthwhile noting. So, and the evidence shows that in the period leading up to Grenfell Tower Phase 5, many of those involved in major construction projects, including clients, contractors, and even architects, regarded building control primarily as a source of advice and assistance. It was even described as an extension of the design team. In many cases, that was how building control saw its role. This was a serious misunderstanding, but was fostered by building control bodies themselves, who preferred to cooperate with applicants to enable proposals to be approved rather than enforce the building regulations rigorously. In our view, that has to change, and it has changed. And that may well be the reason, well, it is the reason why the interactions that those within the built environment with building control bodies is different than it has been in the past. And this is a continuation, because there's an amendment to the legislation which has enabled amendments to the guidance, particularly guidance relating to fire safety. So the context behind this, and all of the amendments to ADB and the amendments to Treble 91, you can see throughout, is a reflection of that Phase 2 inquiry with the criticisms associated with testing bodies. A concern regarding those with impaired mobility and their ability to escape in the event of a fire. Again, hopping back to the Phase 2 inquiry, but also a reflection to bring statutory guidance, approved documents, and other standards up to what have been accepted elsewhere. And we'll come to that shortly. So the first bit of guidance that I'm going to talk about is relating to approved document B 2025. So this came in March of this year. And there's a 6-month transitional period where you need to be sufficiently progressed to be able to work under the old version of ADB, both Volume 1 and Volume 2. So Volume 1 relating to dwellings, Volume 2 relating to buildings other than dwellings have been amended. We're well beyond the progression now in terms of that transitional arrangement. And there's some key changes I'm supposed to be aware of, which we'll cover now. So the first one to talk about is Regulation 38 and fire safety information. The others relating to testing standards, and thirdly relating to sprinklers in care homes. Regulation 38 is in an FSO building, so that's a building that contains flats or premise, so non-dwelling houses. In an FSO building, there is an obligation under Regulation 38 of the building regulations for the person carrying out the works to provide certain information to the responsible person as defined under the FSO at completion of those works. And that information is the guidance to the sorts of information that should be passed across is detailed in ADB Volume 2. And I've extracted some instances here. So it's all the sorts of things that you would expect to see. Compartmentation, location of fire doors, location of dampeners, fire barriers, cavity barriers, the load bearing elements, the fire resistance, all those sorts of things, sprinklers, whether they're installed, whether they're not, maintenance of those, all the sorts of things that you would expect to see from an FSO building. And in essence, it's the fire safety management systems that have been installed in that building. And Regulation 38 requires the person who carried out work to confirm that they've provided that information to the responsible person, and the responsible person to confirm that they've received it and that it's sufficient for them to manage the fire safety of that building going forward due to their obligations under the Fire Safety Order 2005. So if we're looking at responsibility and a clear delineation of responsibility, Regulation 38 is a really good example of that. In the event of something going wrong in the future, there should be no misunderstanding of who was responsible. And us as building control bodies are required to receive those notifications for FSO buildings at the end of the project. And that double knock arrangement, a person carried out the works confirming and responsible person confirming in both instances. And the amendments to ADB provide guidance on the information that should be provided. So that's the first amendment in ADB in March 2025. The other amendment that came in is the removal of BS 476 and the change to BSEN 13501 for reaction to fire. Now, it's really important to understand the difference for reaction to fire resistance. Reaction to fire is what happens to that material when it's exposed to the propagation of flame and exposed to a fire itself. And that is giving a rating. Under BS 476, that was a rating that was known as Class O, which had huge amounts of criticism. And BS 476 had huge amounts of criticism of its suitability as a reaction to fire testing standard under the Phase 2 Grenfell inquiry. And this is the result. So it's been removed. So it can no longer be referenced, that Class O, etc., can no longer be referenced anymore as a suitability to meet the provisions in ADB. And instead, BSEN 13501 provides a classification, which is what happens to that material in the event of a fire. And it's given a classification which is A down to F, so it's rating, A1, A2, B, etc. It's smoke production, S, 1, 2, and 3, and it's droplet production, D, 1, 2, and 3. And the bottom left-hand side with some cladding, which was abutting onto a relevant boundary, so some B4 concerns there. So from fire spread from one building to another, with the cladding abutting that side. Due to the date of that project, which was back 5, 6, 7 years ago, the application of an intermittent paint enabled a Class O rating, which was suitable in that instance to mitigate surface spread of flame from one building to another. Going forward, the class of rating that would need to be achieved would be a BS3 D2 rating. rather than that Class O rating that was referred to. So that's the amendment itself. And I also mentioned about sprinklers as well, and they've become, within the guidance itself, they've become required with all new care homes, residential care homes. Again, that focus on those with impaired mobility. The next amendment to ADB I'm going to talk about comes into force in 2026 in September. And transitional arrangements again in place of 18 months, much longer transitional arrangements. And the reason for that is because the implications are quite significant. So this is the removal of the single stair acceptability for buildings 18 meters in height and above, and also the guidance relating to requirements for evacuation lifts. I'll come to evacuation lifts later on in terms of BS 991. ADB doesn't actually give guidance on what an evacuation lift looks like. That may well come further on down the line when we get closer to September 2026. But at the moment, it's mandating the provisions to include evacuation lifts in buildings that rely on that for the means of escape of the persons at higher levels. And when I'm talking about alignment with other decisions that have been made regarding fire safety, so the London plan, for example, excluded the ability for single stair cases 18 meters above. So it's an alignment with that type of standard. And BS 991 has done exactly the same as well. And the 18-month transitional period is in place because they want to get, it requires a significant redesign to enable that to be accommodated. And that's why that transitional period is so long. The last amendment to ADB that we're going to talk about comes into force in 2029, 2nd of September. And this is quite a significant lead-in that government have given us notification of this change. And this is the removal of BS 476 for reaction for fire resistance, not reaction to fire. Fire resistance being the period for which that material will stay in place as a suitable compartment, for example, fire resistance. And this is illustrated in minutes, a period of minutes that is going to maintain that fire resistance itself. Transitional periods of 6 months. The reason why they've given us so much notice in terms of 2029 is that testing manufacturers, the removal of BS 476, which testing manufacturers rely on massively, particularly relating to fire doors, and changing it to BSEM 13501, it's going to be a huge challenge for the built environment, particularly in terms of the number of testing labs that are able to test in accordance with 13501. You will have seen recently that many products have removed their test data relating to fire resistance. And that's because they, from an insurance perspective, are aware of this change that's coming in 2029 and are concerned that their product or construction type is not going to be able to meet the BSEM 13501 standard, which is much more quantitative, it's much more rigorous in some instances than the old standard in terms of BS 476. So in terms of what that looks like, fire resistance, rather than just a period of minutes, will have a rating which is given as an REI rating. R being load-bearing capacity, E being integrity, so resistance to fire penetration, and I being insulation, resistance to the transfer of heat. And that will be given then a rating in terms of minutes for which those elements will be maintained. So REI 30 minutes, resistance of load-bearing capacity, integrity, and insulation. 60, REI 60, for example. Whereas at the moment we have, for a fire door, for example, an FD20 or an FD30 door that will be, which is tested under BS 476. Going forward after 2029, that will be tested under BSEM 13501, which will give us an REI rating instead. Now, to give a real life example of why that's going to be important for built environment projects is the testing products in accordance with BSEM 13501 is very challenging. As I've already mentioned, a number of products and suppliers and construction methodologies have pulled their product literature because they're concerned they're not going to be able to meet this new obligation under BSEM 13501. Where this may become increasingly challenging is in instances where existing load-bearing elements are being retained in situ. And that will become increasingly important, particularly for projects that are subject to a material change of use. So material change of use defined under Regulation 5 and 6 of the building regulations, where, so to give a very basic example, if we had a agricultural building that was being converted into a new dwelling, and that had a load-bearing element, even though it was an existing element, because B3 under Regulation 6 of the building regulation imposes a requirement, it's obligated to meet that standard. And therefore, there would be a requirement to achieve 30 minutes fire resistance, an REI 30 minutes in terms of those requirements. And I've shown an example here. Prior to the amendments coming in 2029, as I said, fire doors can be tested in accordance with BS 476. And there's lots of guidance showing one that the IFE have worked in terms of with Historic England, where justifications and assumptions regarding a fire door's or a door's integrity can be made. And Appendix C in Table C1 details the need in a dwelling house for a fire door to achieve an FD20 status when tested in accordance with BS 476. And so these are a couple of examples where of a listed building that I looked after 10 years ago or so, it was actually a site office for, and a nearby housing site was taking place, and they were converting it into a dwelling. So it was a material change use under Regulation 5A, and they wanted to create a protected route to meet the requirements of B1. And what they did, these existing doors were retained because it was a listed building. The listed officer was very excited about these existing doors, and the contractors went to a third party and got the doors upgraded using assumptions of the existing door construction, with the installation of intermittent strips around the perimeter, upgrading door stops, application of intermittent paint, and they therefore certified the doors to an FD20 door when tested in accordance with BS 476. This will be much, much, much more difficult after 2029 because that BSEN 13501 standard is much more rigorous and doesn't enable the same assumptions to be made than BS 476 does. And so you can see that for a fire door in terms of material change use after 2029, where it's required to meet the requirement of testing standard under BSEN 13501, it's going to be much, much more difficult. And this won't just be relating to fire doors, it will also be relating to load-bearing elements of structure. So again, the same project, look at the ground floors, that plan on the left-hand side there. So B3 imposes a requirement due to material change use under Regulation 5.6. The guidance within the ADB Volume 1, Table B2, details that the fire resistance should be of 30 minutes because it's a dwelling up to 11 meters in height. Achieving that 30 minutes is challenging because the listed officer was very excited about cornices and coving around the ceilings, and there was a variety of methods that we used to achieve that 30 minutes fire resistance when tested in accordance with BS 476. The photo was shown, the removal of the floorboards, installation of mineral wool suspended on wire netting. Achieving that fire resistance in accordance with 13501 after 2029, much, much, much more difficult. So we've covered the amendments to ADB, which are coming in, have come in 2025 and are coming in 2026 and 2029. But as I talked about, it is your responsibility as competent persons within the built environment to ascertain the guidance that is most suitable for the project that you are designing or undertaking or building or whatever that is. BS 991 is for dwellings or is for residential buildings. Sorry, that's the word I'm looking for residential buildings. And so it provides an alternative to ADB Volume 1. The previous iteration of 991 was in 2015, and in 2024, there were some key updates, which I'm just going to run through here. The entirety of the document is vast, so I won't be able to cover everything, but I'm just trying to extract some key snippets that people may well be interested in. The changes really focus on what we've talked about. For a concern regarding those with impaired mobility, so some guidance regarding care homes, a concern regarding BS 476 as the testing standard, and transition to BSEN 13501, and some guidance regarding stair lifts, stair calls, some amendments to sprinklers and water mist systems, and some focus on the amendments to the two-stair requirement for buildings above 18 meters. So the first section I'm going to talk about is relating to care homes. So care homes are quite a difficult thing to identify the right guidance in terms of the design, because ADB really doesn't cover them a huge amount, and tends to treat them very similarly to non-domestic instances under Volume 2. There's that obligation, as I said, after of March 2025. There's that obligation to install sprinkler systems in accordance with BS 9251 in all new care homes, and it reflects that concern within government for those with impaired mobility. Now, BS 991 provides some really good guidance regarding care homes, and what it does, it splits the dependency of the care home occupants between that of low, medium, and high dependency. And then depending on that classification, it then enables variations within things such as travel distance, which I've highlighted there in terms of Table 20 of BS 991. BS 991 is a guidance document that provides more flexibility because of considerations of things such as management considerations. In terms of, if it's Section 10 of 991, gives guidance on how to assess the dependency of the residents and the management systems in around that building, whether it's phased evacuation, simultaneous evacuation of defend in place, etc., etc. In terms of the dependency, it does the parameters of that guidance really does make a lot of sense, because if it's a high dependent resident, then the travel distances need to be significantly reduced to enable for the care home operative, the care home employee, to get to that person, to then enable them to be mobile and then to get them to a place of safety. In comparison to somebody that's highly mobile and low dependency, who would be able to leave the premise in the event of a fire, in the event of alarm, to a place of safety without any support itself. And therefore, that's what's reflected within the travel distance requirements in that Table 20. The next element I'm going to talk about in terms of 991 is its scope. 991 is suitable. Its scope is up to 100 meters, a very tall building, if the load-bearing elements have a reaction to fire classification A2S1D0. So it's in accordance with BSEM 13501, surprise, surprise. So that's what we're looking at there. It realistically is a concrete masonry construction or similar. Things such as timber frame or SIP panels or similar, BS 991 cannot be utilized if they are above 11 meters. So if they've got a worst rating of A2S1D0, then, and they're higher than 11 meters, it doesn't fall within the scope of BS 991. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't use elements of BS 991 if your building is above 11 meters and has that classification of worse for load-bearing elements, but it would be a variation outside the scope of 991, and therefore would need a competent professional, e.g. a fire engineer, to verify that variation that you've identified. Now, one of the other things that BS 991 does is it makes some commentary and some critical points relating to sprinkler systems and water mist systems. So if you look at the right-hand side of that slide, it shows the 2015 iteration of 991. And what it did, it provided equivalents in that Table 2 for a sprinkler system in accordance with 9251 and a water mist system in accordance with 8458. Water mist systems have now, in the 2024 iteration, been completely removed from 991. And that's led to a lot of consternation, I think, within the water mist system providers, understandably, because they've been removed from 991. When I spoke to the authors of the 2024 iteration 991, there was a number of reasons why they removed it. One is that they have concerns about the reputation of the organizations that produce water mist systems and design them. Their words, not mine. They do also have concerns that the maintenance systems within a residential property are not of the same required standard than a commercial system, and therefore there's some concerns that residential properties aren't going to be sufficiently managed, and there's concerns regarding the maintenance of those water mist systems. The other element is that the body of evidence relating to a sprinkler system being around for nearly 200 years, that they are able to put out fires in vast majority of instances. And the body of evidence for a water mist system, albeit it's probably 30 years, is significantly less. In addition to that is the concern that water mist systems, because the nozzles of those provide a water mist, clues in the title, that the holes themselves could be subject to calcification, particularly in areas of hard water, and therefore wouldn't be able to operate sufficiently when they were needed. Again, go back to that maintenance bit. And the final point I think that they raised was that a sprinkler system itself has uniform parts and systems that can be replaced as and when needed. If one goes faulty, a sprinkler head goes faulty, you can go off and get one, and they're uniform across the built environment. Whereas water mist systems are companies that have specific product types, and they're not interchangeable between those companies. And there's concerns that if one of those companies goes bust, and one of those parts becomes faulty, the ability of the occupant or the owner to replace that part is severely hampered. All of those bits, just because it's been removed from Treble 9.1, does not mean that you cannot justify a building utilizing a water mist system. Doesn't mean that. All it means is it's been removed from Treble 9.1. So what Table 2 does, both in the 2024 and 2015 iterations, is show what's known as permitted variations. So in instances, specific design circumstances, whether it's an open plan loft conversion or an open plan flat, which I'll come to later, if you install a sprinkler system, then you can justify that provision under a code compliant solution as detailed in Treble 9.1. And you can no longer do that utilizing a water mist system. So if you want to use a water mist system as a compensatory feature in inverted commas, then you can do, but you need to engage with a competent professional, e.g. a fire engineer, to stipulate that it is suitable. And I know that lots of water mist systems have started engaging with fire engineers to provide reports very much on that basis. And so talking about those permitted variations, Treble 9.1 shows an instance of an open plan kitchen, shows that 1.8 meter distance from the hob and an additional distance of 0.9 meters between that and the area that people will be escaping from past that kitchen, as long as there's a sprinkler system in accordance with 9251 throughout and an LD1 detection system throughout in accordance with 5839-6. Now, we've talked a lot in terms of the ADB variations about the removal of BS476 and the introduction of 13501, BSEM 13501 as the recognized testing standard, and Treble 9.1 does exactly the same thing. It removes BS476, particularly relating to fire doors, but also for reaction to fire as well. One of the things that I talked about in terms of ADB 2026 was the guidance and the requirement relating to evacuation lists. And this has also been brought through legislation, which came into force in June 2025, relating to disabled PEEPs, personal emergency evacuation plans. And in essence, what Treble 9.1 does is it provides specific guidance on what an evacuation lift should look like when one is required. It does provide additional guidance if you are designing a building in accordance with Treble 9.1 of when a lift should be an evacuation lift. So if you look at the bottom of that 7.4.1 of Treble 9.1, it says for buildings with a story at 50 meters or more above ground level, designed with a stay put strategy, every lift should be designed as a firefighter's lift programmed to function as an evacuation lift until the lift is recalled using the firefighter lift switch. Any lift provided for means of escape should be designed and programmed to function as an evacuation lift in accordance with 7.4.2. In essence, evacuation lift looks like 1100 by 1400. It enables those with impaired mobility, those in wheelchairs, to be able to get out safely. So in terms of the conclusions of ADB Treble 9.1, there is, as I've said before, a reflection of the trends relating to the Phase 2 inquiry, a reflection of guidance elsewhere. So we've talked about the variation from 18 meters high and the reflection of the two-stair policy relating in the London plan. There's a removal and a move away of that BS476 and a change to BSEM 13501, and a real focus in Treble 9.1 for those with impaired mobility, both in terms of care homes and in terms of specific guidance relating to the size of evacuation lifts. So in terms of everything that we've talked about, and I've reiterated again and again about competence and choosing the correct guidance and similar. And that question I asked right at the start is whether a building control final certificate proves compliance to building regulations. Spoiler alert, clearly it doesn't, because the obligation to build in accordance with the building regulations and design in accordance with building regulations lies with, guess what? Those who are building and designing buildings themselves, not with the building control body.